So before I introduce Sean, I just want to welcome you all to the afternoon session. It's post-production time now. We're sort of getting, and I'm delighted to see we don't seem to be having a particularly significant drop-off in numbers, because this is the bit of the game that whether you've shot on film or shot on digital, if you're going to do what's called a digital intermediate, what we're going to be telling you today is all part and parcel of that. First things though, Sean MacLeod Phillips is going to do a 3D masterclass, a 3D description, specifically explaining the differences for shooting anything, actually, 2D and 3D for the giant screen. We're then going to slide into a genuine post-production session. We've got Rick Tester here, who's head of post at Onsite, based in London town, is going to give us a talk about post-production workflow, and then John Darrow from Photochem is going to give us a live demonstration of one of the main tools used in the post-production of 3D images in particular, the Mystica system. Then we'll have a little break, and we'll see how we're doing for time as to how long that break lasts. And then we have Powell Achtel, who is got his lovely underwater rig that you saw in the mini trade show. He's going to be taking us through that and showing us some 3D images. There is an opportunity before he starts to show a 4K version of the Bring Back Our Wide Shots digital DCP that we saw just the last shots of this morning. Hands up if people would like to see the 4K version of the... Okay, we'll do that then. So Powell's very, very kindly given me 15 of his minutes back. We were originally, for that session, going to have at least one other presenter, so he's actually got more than he was expecting, so he's still happy. And happiness is what we want. So, with no more... And then we're going to have visual effects, a visual effects session. So we have got now the section entitled Stereo 3D. There you go. It's going to do what it says on the tin. And Sean Phillips, I first met Sean about 11, 12 years ago or so. Sean is a director, a cinematographer, and a stereographer, and a visual effects supervisor, all of those things rolled into one. I first heard about him because he was the visual effects supervisor on T-Rex Back to the Cretaceous. Hands up who's seen that? I mean, that was a tough old movie. That was a movie shot on film with very complicated visual effects, comping in dinosaurs into background live action film, all in 3D, all looked after by Sean. He was then my director of photography and stereographer on Bugs that we produced 10 years ago. He was the director of Sea Monsters for Nat Geo, and then has done Magnificent Desolation as a director of photography and a stereographer. And here, Journey to the Planets and Robots. Was it Journey to Space? Journey to Space and Robots here, and also the King Kong stereographer on the King Kong 360 ride, that if anyone has spent time ducking into the Universal Studios, he did that as well. So that is Sean MacLeod Phillips, ladies and gentlemen, and he is here to tell us about 3D. Thank you, Sean.
Well, thanks, Phil. Well, I actually like shooting 3D movies, which is crazy, but can everybody hear all right? Okay, terrific. It is. It's kind of loud in here. And this is just kind of a broad but not extremely deep kind of survey of shooting 3D, particularly emphasizing the giant screen and what makes it different from other 3D formats. So right off the bat, I'm going to get first things first. Before you do anything, and I want to echo this because people have mentioned it so many times before, and I want to mention it again because it is always the first and foremost thing that you want to do, and that's script and story drive everything. You really want to test your story before you start testing cameras, because that determines the kinds of cameras you'll use, your approach, your 3D essentially depth map for the movie. Everything stems from that, and you can't repeat it often enough, as much as sometimes we get sick about hearing it and even repeating it. Second thing is picking, once you know your story, is picking and testing the right technologies for the story. Technologies are changing all the time. There's no two 3D jobs I've done in a row that had the same cameras, that had the same pipeline. It is constantly and rapidly evolving. So that's something you want to do closer to the actual production, because from the time you start to raise money to when you actually start to shoot the film, there's probably going to be a whole new generation, or perhaps an entirely new group of cameras that are out there for you to use and test. Third and fourth, and these are extremely important and often ignored to the detriment of many filmmakers, is you really want to view your tests, and you definitely want to shoot tests. Think of ideas, think of new ways of doing things. You want to shoot those tests and view those tests in a giant screen venue. And again, this is one of those things that's just impossible to overemphasize, because the way the venue is changes everything about what you see. For example, how many of you here have seen a dome screening? Is there anybody who hasn't seen a screening in a dome? Okay, great. That's great. That's a good start. So everybody here, most people here, with a few exceptions, have an idea of how different a film looks like on a dome versus a flat screen. And then last of the first things is, if you have a trouble getting to a venue or screening tests, it's relatively simple to create a mock-up of a giant screen venue, and it's getting easier all the time. You know, we're living in the age of 4K consumer monitors, 4K consumer kind of high-end 4K projectors, and with relative ease, it is possible to create a scaled mock-up of a giant screen theater. That you can do right at your production company or an editorial, and you can use that to screen your dailies. It's been incredibly helpful to us over at Ginny Durr's company. She was the producer on many of the films that I've worked on. Is we have a 4K projector, and we started using it on Mysteries of the Unseen World, and it was a lifesaver. We really could not have done that film without that. There would have been so many catastrophes and you know, wrong takes because of bad focus. It really saved our lives. So having kind of set the ground rules, one really important distinction to make is the difference between immersive versus traditional 3D when you're shooting, because they're very different animals. First, to summarize traditional 3D, it assumes that you're shooting and projecting, that you're projecting on a small screen whose edges are always part of the viewer's perception. It is a framed experience, and the screen defines everything that you do with the stereo. The second key aspect with traditional 3D is that it has a wide range of seating close and far from the screen. This makes it a lot trickier to actually design your stereo, because you have to make sure the film works in the back seat. You don't want people to look like miniaturized Lilliputians in the back row. And in the front row, you don't want things to be unfusible, where your eyes cross and can't make the image form. Or worse, in my opinion, when there's so much divergence or wall-eyed, which I'll elaborate on later, that you can't really focus in the far distance. All those compromises have to be taken into account when you're doing a traditional 3D film for a traditional theatrical release. And also, the same rules generally apply, although somewhat differently, to smaller ancillary releases that are now popular, like 3D TV in the home. Now, contrast that with immersive 3D, which is a way of describing what we do here in giant screen cinema. Is the most important part is that the giant screen extends into your peripheral vision as the audience is seated 1/2 to 2/3 of a given screen theater's width away from the screen. And this distance is extremely important. Now, it doesn't matter so much the exact size of the screen as much as that relationship to the screen. The other thing that really matters a lot is the aspect ratio, and that's one reason why the kind of rather quaint but crucial 1:3:3 aspect ratio works so well for this format, is because it fills your periphery not just on the left and right, but also on the top and bottom. The second important aspect is that an immersive 3D experience should have a narrower range of seating. And if you actually look at the way the seats are laid out in the theater here, you'll realize that from the front row to the back is much more compressed than it is in a typical theater. And there's a greater amount of space from the screen to the first rows, which makes a difference in how the stereographer approaches shooting a film for this format. Now, another way to qualify the difference, and another crucial aspect of the immersive experience, of course, is the need for resolution. In other words, the fact that that screen is filling so much of your periphery is what makes resolution so crucial. Is anybody can sit close to a 3D screen and get sort of an immersive experience. But of course, the problem is the image looks really terrible unless you put in sufficient resolution for the images to appear properly rounded and dimensional and just plain sharp, so you can see people's eyes when you look at them, even when they're off in the distance. I can't overemphasize that, and resolution has a really important role with stereo. And I'll give you an example. When I was first teaching myself how to shoot stereo, I bought a stereo realist. My dad found one in a garage sale for $5, and there was a guy in the Pacific Palisades that fixed it for another 95. And I just shot lots and lots of pictures. I went out, shot them, I cut them all together, figured out how to apply convergence, and looked at them in the little viewer, and it was a fantastic tool. One thing that happened, I noticed, is on one exposure, it was at dusk, I took a picture of the family in front of a restaurant, and it was perfectly sharp, and it looked great in 3D when I viewed it. I took another picture, and the camera moved slightly during the exposure. And when I looked at that through the viewer, everything was a cardboard cutout. So when you lose enough resolution, you start to lose the roundness in the subject, and it appears like flat cardboard cutouts, which, unless that's the aesthetic of what you're doing, is generally not something that you're going to want to see. It generally is not an aesthetically pleasing illusion, unless, of course, you're really doing something kind of graphic with flat cutouts and things like that. Now, one critical technical thing to keep in mind, which is very important, is that at this point in time, Giant Screen has two kinds of projection setups for 3D. The IMAX 1570 film projectors are offset 2.5 inches or 63 millimeters based on the orthostereo condition. And that places identical left and right image pairs at infinity when viewed through the glasses. Now, that's very different than how traditional and digital theaters are set up. And it's important to maintain that you have essentially two versions of your film in kind of a large stereo context when you're outputting to film as opposed to when you're going to digital. Now, in contrast, virtually all the digital 3D projection systems out there place identical image pairs at the screen plane. Now, is anyone confused about what I'm meaning here in terms of identical images appearing at the screen plane? Okay. Basically, in terms of 3D, there's three worlds that it brings together. First is the world behind the screen in space, literal stereo space. There's the screen plane itself, and then there's theater space, which is areas closer to the screen, all the way up. It can go as close as your nose, or sometimes even feel like it's whacked you in the face. The key thing with immersive stereo is it erases the boundary of the screen itself. You are no longer aware of the screen edges, and the key rules of traditional stereo do not really apply in the same way. Now, in versioning the film and going out to other formats, you do have to be very aware of what those consequences are. And I'll kind of readdress that as we go forward. But it's important to keep in mind that at the projection level, when you're doing film outs, there are basically two different versions of your film. There's the one for giant screen film, and there's the one for giant screen digital. Now, this next one is kind of a very important one, and it's kind of painful. And if you hear a lot of moaning about 3D and things like that, this is probably where it comes from. I call this the 7 deadly sins of 3D. And I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but probably all of you have experienced some form of this when you've seen a really bad 3D presentation. One at the top of the list is the left and right eye cameras are not in sync. And this is extremely crucial. There are people out there that seem to think you don't even have to synchronize two cameras. And that's technically true as long as nothing moves in the frame, but that's probably not going to be a motion picture. The accuracy in sync has to be tremendous. You know, in the age of digital, you really want a proper tri-level sync, which means that you're almost in sync pixel to pixel. Now, like all filmmakers, I like to push the envelope and try new things and try different cameras. So you do need a certain amount of wiggle room. You know, you want to push the envelope, but you don't want to end up licking the envelope, so to speak. So there is a little bit of leeway, and generally, if you can get the image within one frame, within 1/50th of one frame, you're doing pretty good. 100th even better. Pixel accuracy, great. But in those ranges, you're not going to see any sync errors, and the film will look quite good, even on the biggest screens that you're going to put it on. So there is a little bit of wiggle room in that, but not much. And sometimes you'll screw up, especially the red cameras. It'll shift everything a whole frame, and you can bring it back, and because it's a whole frame, it's not really a problem because the cameras, they are pretty good about matching frame to frame. Sometimes, in the case of the red cameras, they get a little flaky with time code, and you'll have a frame or two or even 6 frames where it's off, but they're full frame errors. And a full frame error is painful for people in post-production. That's another whole group that's going to moan when they hear the word 3D, but at least they can fix it. A subframe sync error is pretty catastrophic because the amount of money to fix it is probably going to be more than what it would cost to just reshoot. Second, pitch, yaw, and roll camera misalignments. You've seen all kinds of variations on that. That's when you've got a vertical misalignment. One image is higher than the other. You've got one image is canted and the other one is not. There's one lens is higher than the other, which creates divergence where you can line things up in the foreground, but you can't align things in the background because you've baked in one lens that's actually higher than the other. This is what camera crews really suffer with, but it's really important to get this right before you shoot any film at all. Next is image size differences between the eyes. If one lens is a little bit longer in focal length than the other, you can have some really serious problems. Zoom lenses are kind of nice in the sense that you can actually tweak them and you can actually line them up almost perfectly. And we can actually maintain that with the use of C-motion and Preston systems that we use for pulling focus. It works extremely well. And when we're ambitious and have time, we can actually get rid of a lot of little errors that exist on all lenses. And keep in mind that lenses are kind of like sausages. You don't really want to know how they're made because if you knew, you'd be a little bit freaked out about some of the things that happen in the analog world with optical elements. Prime lenses are tricky because prime lenses, first of all, are usually not the focal length that's written on the lens. Like, for example, in IMAX, the 40 millimeter is considered kind of the standard normal perspective lens. It actually looks like a wide-angle lens, but in the IMAX theater, it's a normal perspective lens. It's called a 40 millimeter. Its catalog value is actually 40.7, so effectively it's really a 41 millimeter. Now, within batches of those lenses, those will vary, and you'll get images that are sometimes bigger or smaller on other lenses because they were not intended for stereo. They were simply intended to shoot a 2D image. So that's something that, again, the camera crew has to very carefully monitor. Next is lens focus and bokeh differences between the eyes. So, for example, if one lens is sharp and the other one is soft, I think it's pretty easy to guess that that's going to be a problem. But it gets a little bit more complicated in the background. When things go out of focus in the background, you don't want the quality of the out of focusness in the background, i.e. the bokeh, which I think is a Japanese phonetic translation of the English word bokeh, which of course is taken from the French word bokeh. But it means the way the out of focus image looks. It's part of the aesthetic of lenses that cinematographers really respond to and analyze when they're selecting lenses for the creative choices in the process of making a film. Another thing in this category is lens geometry, where some lenses will warp and stretch the image in ways that are much different from a lens made by the same company, even with successive serial numbers. Next is retinal rivalry, and this is a broad category. This is where there are just gross differences between the eyes of which there is no relationship. The left eye is red, the right eye is green, there's some kind of big spot in one eye that's not in the other. That's retinal rivalry, and that also makes the 3D experience potentially unwatchable. Next is excess negative parallax, or cross-eyed. Now, again, I was talking about the three spaces. You've got the space, or the three aspects of stereo. You've got the space behind the screen, and that's called positive parallax. It seems kind of the opposite of Cartesian logic, but that's become the standard, and thankfully it's a standard, so we call that positive parallax. When things come out into theater space, that's called negative parallax. Now, when things come out so far, there's so great an offset in the images that you can't fuse them. Your eyes cross to a point, and they say, you know, I'm just not going to do that. Because when you watch a 3D movie, you're doing things you actually never do in real life. In real life, when we look at something, our eyes converge on it at the same time. When we watch a movie, especially a giant screen movie on a screen that's 70 feet wide, you're being asked to look at something that's infinity, and when it comes off the screen, you're being asked to converge at something close to your nose for extreme stereo. You never do that in real life. Unfortunately, most adults and overwhelmingly children can do that with no problem. But there are limits to that, and if you exceed those limits, it can make your film unwatchable. There's also the opposite problems. If things have too much of an offset, too much of a stereo offset, where the displacement in the image is so great in the distance that your eyes can't follow them because they have to go wall-eyed. And to me, that's even worse than cross-eyed, because you never do that in real life, ever. There's nothing that we look at in the natural world that ever requires our eyes to diverge or go wall-eyed. So that's kind of the 7 deadly sins, and any one of those can create devastating problems in a film, and that's what has made stereo so challenging through the years. It is extremely challenging to shoot, and as agonizing as it is to shoot, it's just as agonizing to take it through the post-pipeline. So it's great for masochists. A next note is just on the nature of convergence. And again, I'm not sure how many minutes I have left, Phil, but I think I have, we got Oh, I think I see it. Do I see a clock up here? I think I do. I think I'm in good shape. Okay, great. Okay. Okay, briefly, convergence is a process where you tow in the cameras to fuse the image and essentially globally set it in space. So figure that the interaxial is the separation between the cameras. That's the raw perspective that's baked into the image. Convergence is the ability to kind of globally slide everything in that space either closer to you or further away. Now, when you do that in the camera, you do create a conversion, an issue that creates misalignments on the film itself. This is exaggerated probably by about 10 to 1, but you'll notice the center line is fine and aligned, and notice the midline across the horizon is centered and aligned, but notice that as you get out into the corners, it gets worse and worse and worse. And that's the danger of using convergence in camera, and nowadays people are generally, with some notable and important exceptions, are actually affecting convergence in post because it only means enlarging the image by a few percentage points, and it gives you control in the post process to actually fine-tune and set the stereo space. So next up, to make a profit, giant screen films need to respect a hierarchy of formats, and 3D, of course, fits into that critically. You have to frame a film so it works in 3D. You have to frame a film so it works in the dome. Obviously, we talked about that yesterday quite a bit. Full domes are a huge challenge, but fortunately with a full dome, you're kind of redefining everything because people tend to just be reclining back, so it's quite a different set of rules. But obviously in a perfect world, you would want to render a different movie for all of these formats, but the full dome is by far the most challenging. There's also, of course, the IMAX digital format, all the other giant screen digital formats, conventional movie theaters, RealD, Dolby, Expand, 3D theaters, HD broadcast, 2D and 3D. So it's a boatload of features. But probably the number one thing that you have to keep in mind is you have to set the stereo of the film based on where its audience is going to be. And you're going to have to make compromises based on that. Now, in 5 years' time, hopefully, maybe as soon as 5 years, it could be 10, but it probably won't be longer than that. Basically, the whole process of setting stereo will probably be a post process, but we still have a ways to go before we reach that process. There's a lot of amazing innovations that are happening very quickly. Until that time comes, we have to make certain compromises with the film as we make it. And they're difficult, and my strongest suggestion is, I think I got, is shoot the stereo for where the film is going to find its audience. Since we make giant screen films, that's what the films are originated for. And in a perfect world, you want to set the stereo for that immersive environment. Probably the best way to define that environment, immersive versus traditional, is ortho stereo. Does anybody know what that word means? Not too many. Okay, good. Okay, ortho stereo is a condition of natural recreation of stereo space in the theater. And IMAX first did it in 1986. It blew me away. I was very young when I saw it, but I realized this was just a huge paradigm change and a very different way of doing stereo. It changed all the rules. And what it did was very simple, is if you take a lens that's about a little under 80 degrees in field of view, and if you set the lenses 2.5 inches apart, and if you do not converge the cameras, i.e. they're both pointing parallel at infinity, when you take that, and let's say you're sitting in front of somebody who's 6 feet away from camera, you take that to the, you print that out, contact print that in 1570, you sit in the middle of the IMAX theater, and that person will look like they are 6 feet away from you, and they will look nice and perfectly round, just like they are in real life. They will have the same scale as they have in real life. And that condition is called ortho stereo. And it also kind of explains why the IMAX film projectors are offset 2.5 inches. That is how you create the traditional ortho stereo condition. Now, as things go digital, it doesn't mean that still isn't true. It just means you have to achieve it differently. And that's just understanding the relationship of ortho stereo to traditional stereo, and understanding how when you shoot it, you've got to carry it through to other formats that will reintroduce, essentially pushing the stereo away to work in smaller formats where you are more aware of the frame edges. 3D obviously requires 2 captures. 2D dome format uses 1 capture but requires the highest image quality. Now, there are things you can get away with on a digital screen. There are things you can even get away with in the 1570 flat screen that you will not be able to get away with in the dome, because in the dome, you're literally stuck into that screen. And without the resolution to work for the shots that you're doing, it could mean that your film simply will not work, and you will never sell it to the domes. Your framing and composition, as I've mentioned, has to work for both. I think we gave some pretty good pointers on that yesterday in terms of where you can frame to best make it work for both primary formats. Let's see. I think I'll skip over this one here. And that's kind of summing up the approach to stereo for the giant screen. You'll find that you need things like floating windows and other tools when you go to ancillary formats, because the amount of parallaxes that you have in an IMAX film, you know, they could easily be 5%. Sometimes they'll exceed it even more. Are tougher to manage on a smaller format, and using tools like floating windows, not to mention converging the image back, are very effective at making it work for the greatest number of formats. So next is how we shoot in 3D. I don't really want to get into cameras so much as the rigs that they work on. I'm going to start, primarily these are camera agnostic 3D systems. That means it doesn't really care what the cameras are so much, because the rig can take newer cameras as they come along. There are primarily two kinds. There's parallel and mirror-based systems. Parallel is very simple. Cameras are side by side. They're either on a rig or they're integrated into a single camera body. Now, obviously, when it's integrated into a single camera body, it's no longer camera agnostic because it is the camera. But all other forms of parallel rigs are essentially camera agnostic. The advantage of parallel rigs are generally lighter and easier to use than mirror rigs. You don't need as big a crew. They're easier to understand. They're easier to move because they're lighter. They can fit into more types of rigs, mounts, and configurations. Specific examples, the IMAX 3D digital camera, which is here today, of course. Here we see it in a picture. It's got all its accessories and everything. A matte box, monitors, all the standard tools that are needed. This is all the technical information which you probably got there. It's a great system because it's very portable and compact. But again, and it weighs 26 pounds and it can shoot up to 120 frames per second. So it's a very, very effective tool in the field. You can put it on a Steadicam, you can put it on a lot of remote heads. Like most parallel rigs, very, very versatile and kind of camera mount friendly. Here's another example of a parallel rig. This is for shooting long lens, which is basically just a very, very robust stout mount. You can see the cameras are side by side, which means you've got, in this case, about a 5-inch interaxial. And that's usually pretty horrible if you're shooting indoors, but if you're outdoors and you're shooting wildlife that are usually running away from you and you're chasing them, it actually works out quite well. In fact, to keep the image from looking like a cardboard cutout, you actually expand the interaxial to very abnormal ranges. There is one serious consequence to that, however. That's easy to do and pretty much automatic if you're in a vehicle and you're looking down at the lions that are coming at you. A lot of times, you can actually, because you're not seeing such a huge range of space from near to far, you can expand the interaxial and take the flattening effect of a telephoto lens out of the image. Now, sometimes you have a nice composition, you've got a beautiful shot of a lion against a mountain that's way in the distance. That shot will never work on a long lens because to view it in the theater, you're going to have to reduce the interaxial to such that you basically see a cardboard cutout lion in front of a cardboard cutout mountain in the distance. And the ground plane looks virtually like almost another cardboard cutout. That's because you've got so much distance between one object with a limited roundness and a huge distance of space, in this case infinity. You cannot photograph that. It simply is not possible. Now, one thing you could do is you could run out there with a green screen, put it behind the lion, increase your interaxials, shoot him at one set of interaxials, and then bring the interaxial in, switch to a mirror rig, pull the green screen away, and shoot the background. But obviously, not only is that impractical for wildlife shooting, that's really impractical for any kind of, certainly any kind of documentary filming, and even in a feature film, as I was discussing, about Hugo yesterday, that's a tough thing to do. It interrupts the flow of the picture. And I'll get into a solution at the very end of my speech. But not sure how many minutes. Anybody? Oh, okay. I'm going to speed it up. Here's a little compact parallel rig, and here's another crazy thing. It was a lot more fun to build than use. It actually didn't work very well, but it could be the solution for something. Okay, mirror rigs. Only a mirror rig allows complete 3D control of the image, typically a 0 to 3 inch interaxial. That's the spacing between the camera lenses. It is essential for close-ups and macro work. It was kind of our workhorse on bugs. And if you can shoot with only one camera system and you're shooting relatively normal scenes, especially relatively intimate scenes, a mirror rig gives you the most options. That's the only camera that will be able to do everything for you if you can only choose one camera. And usually you want to have other choices. Here's the CC3D mirror rig with the F65s. This is a large, heavy rig, but these cameras, I think the consensus was from the tests we saw, the F65 was quite I think it was the winner of the camera competition there. But it's a very heavy and a high center camera. This rig was kind of specially designed to hold it, and hopefully they were happy with it in Jerusalem. And this is the same rig with Red Epic 5K, 6K cameras, which it holds quite easily. And both were actually operated by this Steadicam operator, that's Scott Hoffman, who is a rare and brave Steadicam operator. Here's just typical camera mounts. These are light enough to put on a full stabilized crane rig for shooting wildlife or whatever. This is also another versatile way to shoot. This was used for robots for shooting the DARPA competition. It has pan, tilt, and roll. It's all stabilized. The arm telescopes about 35 feet out, back and forth, so you can poke yourself into little places where robots are hiding and film them quite effectively and quickly, all in real time. We had a 3:1 zoom lens on the camera. Any more than that, and it starts to just turn into a cardboard cutout, so that was plenty of zoom range for us. And it worked pretty well for just having one camera. This is a little mirror for shooting macro. It's an accessory, which is nice. So if you have an ordinary rig, in the case of the CC3D rig, you can put this little mirror on and shoot your macro shots and actually have room to light the scene. This is the same rig on the Steadicam. Here it's in kind of a Garfield mount mode, low mode. Here's a little mirror rig that's on a car mount. Here's a rack over rig. We use these quite a bit on Mysteries of the Unseen World for shooting time-lapse. In controlled interior environments where things don't move between frames. It gives you total stereo control. Next up, Gorilla 3D rigs. Documentary shooting often requires extremely low profile shooting with minimum crew sizes. Depending on the subject matter and use, Gorilla rigs can be used effectively. You do not want to use these cameras in all conditions, however. The uses are very limited and have to be respected. This is one I built for robots. We were kind of out of money. Had a few weeks, so I built a little rig and mounted 2 GH4 Panasonics on it. Figured out a way to synchronize them within, well, it started out at about 1/100th of a frame, and after 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it dropped to about 1/50th of a frame, which is good enough. It was a little funky, but it worked well. This is a hand-holdable rig. It's extremely light. We had a 4-person crew. It was Jenny Durr, the producer. She was the fixer and master arranger of everything. I was the second unit director. It was Mike Slee's film, but I was the one sent out to capture some of the robots in the field. And I was also the DP and the camera operator and the stereographer. And Bobby, this is on location here. That's Bobby, my key grip. He was doing all the gripping as well as the lighting for the shoot. We had an awesome 1,200 watts of light total, LEDs. There's an Android in the foreground there. And this rig works in intimate settings, all of which these were. We were never far away. We were never outside. We never did a long shot. And the Micro Four Thirds format is wonderful for documentaries because it gives you a lot of depth of field, and I did not have to pull focus. I could set it based on depth of field and leave it. If we had had to pull focus, we would have needed another crew member. Things would have taken far longer, and it was a wonderful little niche to shoot just a particular kind of range of things. But I would never, ever, ever take this camera outdoors and start shooting things with any kind of a distance to them. Here's the handheld version. Oh, 3 minutes, okay. 3 minutes, okay. This is the handheld version here, and this will also work in a lighter configuration on a Movi. So you can do, fully stabilized handheld shots. And again, don't start doing wide shots with it because it's not going to work. You can do wonderful scenes in an interior, moving the camera between people that are close to camera. any wider, and it just doesn't work. Here's other cameras, the infamous GoPro. You can see it here on this robot. If you look close here, it's under his chin. Here, this was a 4K GoPro, and the quality was it was better than what I expected. And I think it works in the film because it's essentially the robot's POV, and you kind of accept the fact, okay, it's a little funky looking, there's some weird fisheye distortion, it's a little bit noisy, the reds are flat. Again, the license of the way the story is told by the director allows it to work for the context it's used. And lastly, 2D to 3D conversions. I just want to mention these because at typical budgets, i.e. low, conversions work best on wide shots with modest 10 to 20 pixel stereo offsets with stereo placed behind the screen window. It's generally not immersive unless the budget expands to make it so. Quality conversions should be considered VFX shots and require higher budgets than wholesale conversions intended only to maximize revenue for content from other platforms. Quality 3D conversions are very effective for long lens shots and for fixing problem shots. Again, going back to the whole problem of the lion against the distant mountain. That's a classic shot where you want to do a conversion. I wouldn't even waste time shooting a shot like that on a long lens in stereo because you're just going to have to do a conversion. And that sums it up. Any questions?
What about this Gemini camera?
Well, you're talking about. I assume you're not talking about the Gemini recorder. You're talking about the Gemini film camera system. Yeah, that was a film version of the. You know, you could. It's kind of like a predecessor, I suppose, of the IMAX digital camera or a follower of the Solido. Because it's VistaVision, you know, we found that VistaVision has been blown away by digital cameras in terms of its quality. There is a look to film, which I like about it. I'd love to shoot with the camera, but in practical reality and in terms of the actual raw resolution, it has been exceeded by digital cameras. Anybody else?
Question.
Yeah.
Sean, you said to make a profit, films need to respect a hierarchy of formats.
A hierarchy of formats, yes.
And I assume the list you put up is in ranked order.
No.
Well, let me pursue this.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put you on the spot to answer.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else in the room who can help us out here. You had 1570 3D film theaters.
Right.
And then you had 1570 2D dome theaters.
Right.
Does anybody know sort of the weighted average? Because I assume you're talking about return on investment or attendance.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a producer's question. I think
Right.
Mike, I assume you're probably. I think what you're saying is that the dome should be number one.
Of course.
Okay.
As the chair of the Giant Dome Theater Consortium,
Good question, Mike. Thank you very much.
let me
And
give
Jonathan
you
Barker
a
is
point,
going to
a
answer
frame
that for
of
you.
reference here. For example, we have 7 theaters, IMAX Dome theaters, U.S.-based, and for the Tornado Alley film, we delivered 1.2 million viewers. 1.2 million viewers from 7 theaters, which I think if you do the math, runs pretty well above the average of what Paul Fraser's study indicated. So again, I'm just looking for...
Let me address
Some
that,
reference.
Mike,
Thank you. I
because
appreciate that.
I can
Thank
do
you.
it because obviously when we set out to
Terrific.
make Flight of the Butterflies, it was an absolute requirement that this work both in 3D, flat screen, well, in all screens in that list of hierarchies. And the dome issue was extremely important to us. And as we've said in some other presentations at various times, Miles Connolly and I on set were constantly looking over the shoulder of the DP and director and telling them to reframe it for the dome, and we got the nickname Dome Nazis. But I will tell you very specifically, on Flight of the Butterflies, I just looked last week at the list of the top 10 grossing theaters worldwide, and 3 of those were domes. So, I mean, very significant numbers, as you know yourself. So I don't think it's a question of saying one is more important. I think that with the domes, I think you have only 2 choices. You either make a film for the domes, which I think might be interesting and viable depending on the subject, or you make a film that works for the flat screen, 3D, and domes. And if you're I would say submit that the most intelligent way to produce a film is to satisfy both of those without any order of priority, but do both. Because otherwise you're going to, miss out on money. Very simple.
I mean, I suppose if I was given all the money in the world to make a dome film, I'd use a 15 perf 65mm camera and a 30mm fisheye lens and place the action right in the spot for a dome film. And then it would be 100% fantastic for the dome. You'd have a print-off original neg, you'd be using the right lens, you'd have enough resolution to fill the dome, but I couldn't then extract a flat 3D movie out of that. So whilst it's not a hierarchy, there's a tiny hierarchy insofar as you then have to, then you go into, that's no compromise. So you do have to go into the compromise zone of doing frame extensions and dropping it down and a special grade and gradding out the top, which hopefully, until someone invents a system that is 100% equal for both, that's what people are going to give you. Yes?
I'm currently finishing up a 3D dome project using Infotech.
And to answer Mike's question, the domes are a very unique experience, and I'm constantly amazed whenever I see the film in the dome, because that is part of the process. I cannot, in conscious, make a film where I say, screw the domes or something like that. It's like the domes are part of the process, and they are a unique experience. And to be honest, I'd love nothing more than to do a film that is just designed for the domes, where I can compose the shots just for the domes. And I would love that. And in fact, I love it so much, I'd say, yeah, I'll shoot the dome movie, and you can take that and somebody else can dimensionalize it or whatever for the other markets, because at least I know I made a film for the format that I thought I could really make it use that format as much as humanly possible. And
Any other burning questions? Okay, well, thank you. Well, one quick one, Gord. But does it include lots of formulae in your question? If anyone wants to email Gord about technically being able to extract a flat 3D movie out of a single fish-eyed image, he's got a plan. We'll do a test on it. That's what I think we'll do. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Sean Phillips, you've been a rock star.